Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is being presented as part of the Shine a Light campaign, which seeks to illuminate the dangers of anti-Semitism through education, community partnerships, workplace engagement, and advocacy. Moderating today's conversation is Manya Brashear-Pashman, co-host of AJC's weekly podcast, People of the Pod. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Manya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire, and welcome to this live recording of People of the Pod. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Hanukkah, the 8-day Festival of Lights, is a celebration of resilience, the power of faith, the freedom to worship. It's actually quite meaningful for the Jewish people, especially this year when attacks against American Jews rose at least 80% in the month of May alone during the conflict with Israel sparked by terrorists in next-door Gaza. With me to discuss the significance of Hanukkah, how that has evolved over the years, and how to make it an even more powerful experience for our families and communities are three of AJC's modern-day Maccabees, warriors in their own right. Melanie Maron Pell, AJC's Chief Field Operations Officer, Julie Rayman, AJC's Senior Director of Policy and Political Affairs, and Holly Huffnagle, AJC's Director for Combating Antisemitism in the U.S. Ladies, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you.
So, Melanie, Julie, I don't know about you, but I was in my daughter's Montessori school earlier this week, armed with a squeegee bottle of grape jelly and some donut holes to make Hanukkah meaningful for 4- and 5-year-olds, a majority of whom are not Jewish. So I admit I added my own 2 cents about the Maccabees' victory, but I'm pretty sure it went over all of their little heads. But I'm curious, as Jewish advocates and mothers, how do you make Hanukkah meaningful for both your little ones and for adults that you encounter in your day-to-day work?
So I'll kick things off. First of all, it's great to be with you all. So hello, and hello to all of our audience. Thanks so much for listening and for those who are watching live. So I'm the mom of a 7.5-year-old, and he is really at the age where he's starting to appreciate what it means to be a minority. He's starting to have that sense of how come we don't get off school for Hanukkah? And he's starting to ask me those questions. And how come more people celebrate Christmas than Hanukkah? So we're starting to have these conversations. And last night when we were lighting candles in particular, I was really moved myself. I think he thought I was losing my mind a little bit, but I was telling him, this is what Jews around the world are doing tonight. We are practicing a tradition that goes back thousands of years that is so, so special because we are Jewish, and what a blessing and a gift it is to be Jewish. So I'm trying to help him understand that, yes, we may be part of a community that is not the cultural norm or mainstream, but that what we have and what we have to celebrate is truly beautiful. And if I may, I will tell you a quick story that I cannot get out of my mind because it's something that happened this morning. I was invited to speak here in Louisville, Kentucky, where I live, to a Rotary Club. One of my neighbors is part of a Rotary Club. And I was talking about the Jewish community, and I was talking about some of our traditions, and I was talking about anti-Semitism and about the need to shine a light on anti-Semitism. And one of the questions I was asked was by someone who was not asking with hostility, but he asked me the question, do you think that Jews sometimes bring on discrimination onto themselves by being so upfront about your Judaism? And I had to take a deep breath, and say we are keeping up traditions that go back thousands of years, and it's related to what I was thinking about what I teach my child. And I'm proud of being Jewish, and I would much rather be visible than invisible. And so I think that, our celebration of our holidays, our understanding of the importance of our holidays, our Jewish pride is so fundamental, both to us as individuals, but also to teach our children.
Wow. That is, I don't know that I would have been able to keep my composure, Melanie, in that moment. I would like to think that I could. It's an honest question, right? I mean, he was asking an honest question, and these are the questions that are out there. Julie, I'm curious if you had take a different approach than Melanie. I think your children are slightly younger.
I have a 3-year-old and a just barely 6-year-old. And if you'll forgive me, I want to also tell a little story just to start out with, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. AJC has a partnership with an organization of European young Jewish professionals. The organization is called U.S, and each year they hold a summer program bringing together young Jews from all over Europe. And one year I had the privilege of representing AJC and teaching a few sessions on advocacy. I say few because there were only a few sessions at all and lots of summer fun. And I asked the organizer, who was a very serious, savvy advocate, why is there so much fluff? And she responded that it's been really hard to be a young Jew in Europe. And they wanted to remind people that there's also joy in being Jewish. And recently I realized, and I hope this is the sign of the times and not a comment on my parenting skills, but in my household, we talk much more about anti-Semitism than we do about Judaism or Jewish culture. Not appropriate for a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old.
Right.
But I remember that summer experience and what she told me. And so this year, intentionally, we've been really focused on bringing the joy. So we're playing a lot of dreidel. We're watching a lot of the David Diggs Puppy for Hanukkah video, and really just trying to have fun.
Yes, yes. There has been a lot of David Diggs in our house, which is probably not a wise choice on my part because my son really does want a puppy for Hanukkah. So it just exacerbates that. But you raise a good point. There is so much joy in the Jewish tradition. And Hanukkah is one of those moments, one of those times of the year when we really should play up the joy. Holly, not to put you on the spot, but you are tasked with leading AJC's efforts to combat anti-Semitism, and you are Christian. Growing up, celebrating Christmas, what was your understanding of Hanukkah? I mean, was it Christmas for the Jews, or did you understand it as much more than that? And at what point did you realize this is actually a festival that marks some of the earliest efforts by Jews to defend the freedom to worship?
Thank you, Manya. So my best friend growing up was Jewish. So I may have had a slightly greater understanding of Hanukkah than other non-Jewish American children, but I do think I saw it as a Jewish Christmas. And I remember being envious when I was little that my friend got presents for 8 days and I only got presents for 1. And I actually asked my parents about, more days for presents. But now, I know more about the history of the holiday, even how it's celebrated in the United States. Both Christmas and Hanukkah, became increasingly commercialized in the United States, especially in the 20th century, with lights on our homes and decorations. And I know many Jews who also have lights on their homes, decorations. You see the elf on the shelf has become Minch on the bench. And a lot of this is for children to celebrate these holidays together. But now, removed from those younger years, and today in the field of combating anti-Semitism professionally, Hanukkah takes on new significance. It really wasn't until much later in my life, in the last 10 years, that I really learned what Hanukkah meant about the rededication of the temple after the Maccabean Jews regained control of Jerusalem. And I think about what the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs said about Hanukkah, when he noted that the Maccabees' victory was actually short-lived, and within the century, Rome took over. And he said this, and I'm quoting him here. He said, "Yet Rome's civilization declined and fell, while Jews and Judaism survived. Something in the human spirit survives even the worst of tragedies, allowing us to rebuild shattered lives, broken institutions, and injured nations. That is the Jewish story. Jews survived all the defeats, expulsions, persecutions, and pogroms, even the Holocaust itself, because they never gave up the faith that one day they would be free to live as Jews without fear. That is the ever-renewed power of the faith whose symbol is Hanukkah and its light of indistinguishable hope," end quote. So that's something that I've taken on now.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of the traditional toast for any Jewish holiday. We fought, we overcame, now let's eat. Now let's celebrate the joy of the holiday. Holly, you wrote a lovely column earlier this week. Recently, we have been talking about the joy. What are some of the positive developments in the fight against anti-Semitism? I mean, what progress has been made, let's just say, in the past year?
Absolutely. So when we focus on anti-Semitism, I think especially as we've seen it rise in the United States in the past few years, it's easy to kind of go into a mode of despair and really only focus on the negative. And there is a lot of negative, but there are places to be hopeful in the fight against anti-Semitism this past year. And really here are a few of them. We know now from our report, from our surveys that we released in October, that American Jews actually feel more secure in America today than they did a year ago. So while 43% felt less secure in 2020, that number's declined to 31% feeling less secure in 2021. That's still a big number, but that's a good trend. There's also greater understanding of the term anti-Semitism by the general US public this year. So while 34% of US adults still are not familiar with the term anti-Semitism, and that is still a problem, but that's an improvement over the 46% of US adults who were not familiar with the term last year. In addition, today, more Americans recognize the statement that Israel has no right to exist as anti-Semitic. So in our 2021 report this year, we found that 85% of US adults said that statement is anti-Semitic, compared to 74% who said it last year. And this year, we also saw new resources made available to enable better reporting of anti-Semitic hate crimes. So the Jabhara Hire No Hate Act was signed into law this past May, and it now links hate crime reportings to Department of Justice training and grants and resources. And so we're really going to be able to close those gaps, hopefully, in the future. And then just two last hopeful points, if I may. I think one, we do need to actually look to Europe for some hope. And Julie mentioned talking about young European Jews and joy, but in the fight against anti-Semitism as well. When AJC first started raising alarm bells in Europe about rising contemporary anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, decades ago, we really were met with a lot of resistance by government leaders and policymakers. And we can say that today, that's really not the case. There's still challenges, but we can look to the appointment of the EU coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein. We can look to the fact that the majority of EU member states have adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. There was a 10-year strategy, an action plan just to combat anti-Semitism that the European Commission published just a couple months ago. And there were pledges that happened in Malmo in Sweden in October, governments around the world pledging specifically to combat anti-Semitism. So that's hopeful. And then the very last thing I'll mention is actually a hopeful sign at the United Nations. And I realize that when I say that there's glimpses of hope within the UN to fight anti-Semitism, it may raise some eyebrows, but there truly is. And our Jacob Blaustein Institute is actively working with many people, but specifically with UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, to combat anti-Semitism as a human rights problem and connecting those two. Anti-Semitism is a human rights issue. And Dr. Shahid's report, which we were able to contribute greatly to the UN General Assembly, actually documented all of this in detail. So those are a few pieces of good news, Manya. And of course, the last thing I'll say is that the hopeful signs should not by any means be replaced with complacency. We have to continue to be vigilant.
Yeah. You mentioned Katharina von Schnurbein. She was a guest here on People of the Pod just a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Shahid has been on the podcast as well. Yes, both of those figures are really working very hard to fight anti-Semitism around the globe. Julie, you've worked very hard to fight anti-Semitism on Capitol Hill. What progress has been made in that arena?
It's such a good question. And as Holly said, one of the biggest challenges that we have in combating anti-Semitism is simply the awareness of anti-Semitism. And one of the things that we've seen in the past, I don't want to say only this past year, but in the past several years, is that elected officials in the United States now, probably more than ever in recent memory, understand the real and present threat of anti-Semitism. Our elected officials are the first line of defense. And so it's critically important that they understand. And we can sort of look at impact here as well, that there are more than 150 representatives and 58 senators on the bipartisan task forces for combating anti-Semitism is amazing. They've all recognized the problem and they've committed themselves through membership in those task forces to be a part of the solution. That's huge. Yeah. Like Holly said, there are problems. The problems persist, and it's still way too easy for politicians to point out and condemn anti-Semitism from the other party and not their own, or instrumentalize it for their own political gain, but the awareness and the willingness to address it is really something worth celebrating. And just this week, as we're shining a light on anti-Semitism, we've seen elected officials really step up. And governors from South Dakota to Connecticut to Montana are embracing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition on anti-Semitism. New York, Delaware, Ohio, and more are talking about anti-Semitism, talking about the need to address it. So on the federal level, on the state level, elected officials are understanding that this isn't an issue that's of particular interest just to the Jewish community, but really a broader threat to American values in our democracy, and are willing to step up.
Well, Holly also mentioned the No Hate Act and the passage of that earlier this year. And that was a long time coming, right? That was not an easy thing to accomplish. What do you think pushed it over the edge earlier this year and made it succeed finally?
I would love to be able to take this moment to talk just about like the strength of coalitions, because it really was this amazing collaboration between Jewish groups and Asian American groups and Muslim groups and Latinos and African Americans, and really a full swath of American society who recognized that they and their friends and neighbors could be victims of hate crimes. But I think sadly, it was the reality of hate crimes in America, and the fact that every time people were turning on their news, they were seeing, in various spikes throughout the year, huge numbers of hate crimes against Asian Americans, against Black Americans, against others. So sort of that in-your-face recognition really probably was what brought it to the point where it could actually be passed. But the beauty is that those coalitions endure, and the recognition that we're all sort of part of this experience together will carry us not just through the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, but into the next, challenges and the policy prescriptions to address them.
Yeah. Melanie, you oversee a lot of the local work on the ground in places, like you said, Louisville, Kentucky, right there in your backyard, Dallas, Texas, Beverly Hills, California. What progress has been made on the ground around the country that you've seen this past year?
I think you're going to sense a theme, awareness, 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 awareness. We recognize and we understand that the first step in combating something is making people aware that it exists, making sure they understand what it is, how to define it, how to identify it, and then what to do about it. So we're spending a lot of time through the great work of our AJC regional offices across the country, working closely with Holly and Julie and their teams to try and make sure that we are part of the awareness raising from the very local level, all the way up through the state level, onward to members of Congress and beyond. And we understand that. So as Julie mentioned, we're seeing the awareness being raised because AJC and many other organizations, but certainly AJC, are working hard to make sure that our elected officials and civic leaders at every level really understand what's happening. What we know is that much of the inaction is simply because they're not paying attention and they're not aware of what's happening. It's not necessarily nefarious. So it is our job to make sure they are aware. It's their job too, of course, but we are there to help make sure that they understand the reality of the problem. They understand the complexity of the problem. They hear our ability to describe the many sources of anti-Semitism. We're not blaming any one particular corner of the population for anti-Semitism. We're saying this is a problem that takes many forms, it's complicated, and you need to understand it. And that if you do understand it, you will also understand how it connects and becomes almost a harbinger of other ills that exist within our communities and society and other forms of hate. So we think it's really important for them to understand. So what we're doing in order to help make those changes is we are out there presenting our survey data and our AJC resources and tools across the country, both at the very local level. So to city councils, to mayors and their staffs, to state legislators, to various civic groups, to community groups, to Jewish groups even around the country, so that more and more people are aware of the problem, are aware of some of these alarming statistics and are talking about it. And then we're able to say, we have some important tools. As Julie mentioned, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which we believe is the gold standard of definitions of anti-Semitism, is something we have seen with our encouragement and advocacy, mayors, city councils, state governments, different bodies, municipal bodies, adopting this definition and saying, we understand that this definition will help us define and identify and understand anti-Semitism more fully. That's really important. I want to give a shout out to our colleagues in New Jersey with the great work of our New Jersey regional office. AJC worked with the leadership of the New Jersey State League of Municipalities, which is currently the president is the mayor of Clinton, New Jersey. This is a mayor we've worked with. She understood the importance of this issue. She presented a resolution at their annual meeting last week on confronting and combating anti-Semitism that includes language resolving that the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism should be made available as an educational resource for municipalities across the state. So this resolution was passed. It includes 565 New Jersey municipalities, over 560 mayors, 13,000 elected and appointed officials. They shared this resolution with the Attorney General, with the governor, the lieutenant governor, the New Jersey State Assembly and State Senate. So we're trying to find ways to create these multiplying effects to raise awareness and share these tools and resources. And the last thing I'll say is, well, I should also mention, in addition to something as specific as New Jersey, AJC works with mayors across the country. We have a partnership agreement with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We've done trainings for the National Association of Attorneys General, with the National Association of Secretaries of State. We're really trying to get to as many of these leaders as possible so that we can stay in touch with them and so that we can be a resource to them. And so that when things happen, we can proactively reach out to them and say, hey, you want to talk about this? We can help you understand what's going on. Or if they're facing a situation in their community, they will come to us and say, hey, what do we do? How do we help?
So I want to ask you this, Melanie. I mean, it's not apathy on the part of these mayors, right? I mean, mayors are dealing with, keeping the water clean and the sewers working and the streets free of potholes. I mean, they've got more of immediate, acute concerns to worry about, a plethora of them in their municipalities. So how do you get through all of that and make them aware and help them make this a priority?
So one of the things that, one of the conversations we've had a lot with a lot of our whether it's our coalition partners or elected officials, is helping them understand a little bit more about Jewish history and how, while we may exist in their communities as a community that they view as highly educated, by and large, fairly affluent, comfortable, working in a lot of the professional class, all of the sort of generalizations one might make about many in the American Jewish community, although certainly not all. We want them to understand that our history has taught us that our situation in any given place is precarious and that it is vulnerable and that we can't ever let our guard down. And that we have seen time and again throughout the millennia that Jewish communities that were very comfortable suddenly find themselves in an extremely hostile place. So therefore, it is incumbent upon all of us, and we need our leaders to lead in this regard, to make sure that not even a whiff of it is allowed or acceptable or ignored or brushed under the rug, that we need them to be out front. Most of the mayors across the country are really trying to find ways to make their cities good places to live for everybody. And one of the ways they can do that for the Jewish community is helping the Jewish community feel like they're with us and they're paying attention and they're aware of our concerns. So again, it's about raising the awareness and making sure we have those personal connections. And once we have their attention, really, by and large, we've seen the universe of mayors has really been eager to stand with us.
And Julie, I kind of want to flip that question a little bit and turn to you and ask, how do you get through all of the politics in Washington to make them aware and help them make anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, not hatred of each other, because they're on different sides of the aisle, but how do they make the hatred of Jews or any minority a priority? and protecting that minority a priority?
I don't think it's so different with members of Congress as it is for the mayors, as Melanie described. And one of the things that sometimes we forget is that our elected officials at the end of the day are people too, really busy people, but they're people. And I think what we found in our survey about the American population also applies to a lot of our elected officials, right? So in AJC's most recent report on anti-Semitism in America, we looked specifically at how people saw and recognized the uptick in anti-Semitic attacks this past May after the conflict with Hamas and in Israel. And for Jews, we felt this acutely, right? We were watching the media reports of Jews being physically attacked in Los Angeles, New York, and elsewhere. 71% of American Jews said they heard a lot or some about those attacks. But most Americans, 53%, said they hadn't heard anything. They didn't know what was going on. And it's really important for us in advocacy and in life to sort of step outside of our boxes and say, we know this, right? Like we know what's happening to Jews, just in the same way that we know Jewish sensitivities. We know the tropes and the triggers that will make our hair on the back of our neck rise and say, like, oh, that's anti-Semitism, like Melanie's experience at the Rotary Club this morning. But most people don't know that, right? So a part of our advocacy in life and in work is simply raising that awareness, raising that education.
So you mentioned the report, and Holly, I want to turn to you again. I know this is shine a light on anti-Semitism, but let's take a darker turn and talk about some of the more discouraging findings in that report that Julie just mentioned.
So Manya, there were unfortunately discouraging findings. I think we expected it, but we were, our own awareness was raised even more by what we found. So a few of these unfortunate findings. One was that we found that 1 in 4 American Jews, 24%, have been the targets of anti-Semitism in the past 12 months alone. Really digging down just in the last year, 1 in 4 American Jews have been targeted by anti-Semitism. We also found that 4 out of 10 American Jews have changed their behavior at least once over the past 12 months out of fear of anti-Semitism. That included, not posting something online that would identify them as Jewish, not identifying themselves as Jewish, or revealing like how they might think about as Jews. It also made avoiding certain places or events or situations out of their fear of anti-Semitism. So that was an unfortunate finding. Another discouraging finding was that Americans see anti-Semitism in America. I was personally surprised to learn that 41% of Americans have seen anti-Semitism in the past year, and 31% have seen it more than once. And yet, only 44% of the U.S. general public believe that it's actually, increased in the past 5 years. So the Americans are seeing anti-Semitism. There's a disconnect whether they're aware that it's increasing, whereas we know that 82% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased. And finally, a disheartening note about about young American Jews. So we learned about how they experienced anti-Semitism differently than U.S. Or than American Jewish adults. So for instance, of the American Jewish adults who were familiar again with the attacks against Jews during the conflict between Israel and Hamas, 72% said it made them feel less safe as a Jewish person in America. But that number jumped to 84% for young American Jews ages 18 to 29 who felt less safe as a Jewish person in America. And we also found that young American Jews were more likely to avoid posting content online that would identify them as Jewish. They were more likely to avoid those places, events, or situations out of concern or for their safety or comfort as a Jew. So those are all discouraging findings. But I think what matters is what we do with those. Like, what do we do with those discouraging findings? How do we then combat anti-Semitism using these findings? And for AJC, that really means data-driven advocacy. So it means using our data about how Jews were targeted by anti-Semitism on social media to encourage Congress to reform Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, again, to work to hold large tech platforms liable when their algorithms are proven to promote harmful content. It means going to the tech companies themselves, showing our data and saying, we really need you to adopt a universal standard of what anti-Semitism is. And you need to have consistent artificial intelligence and human moderation. And you need to make your technology more humane and more user-centered. It means taking our data to private businesses, right? And ensuring that their DEI framework recognizes Jewish diversity and that anti-Semitism is seen as more than a religious bias. Companies, if they're aware of the connection that most Jews around the world have to Israel, either historically, religiously, or culturally, they'll be able to more successfully promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace and not discriminate against Jewish employees. So our data can be used in so many different ways. And so even though it's discouraging findings, it's really what we do with the findings that's going to matter.
And do people listen? I mean, when you go to these tech platforms and these private companies armed with that data, do they listen? Does it make them more responsive, or do they shrug their shoulders and I mean, what is the kind of response? Is it an uphill climb, or are we coasting here?
I was just going to say it's an uphill climb. I was going to say it's kind of like pushing that rock up the hill. It kind of rolls down, and you continue to push it up. But that's what we have to do. Like that is our responsibility in this space, because with patients, and we know that this is not a sprint, right? This is a marathon. We're in this for the long game. But with patients, with that persistence, with those building of relationships, actually, I should say, with the tech platforms, with engaging with them, as not necessarily as a best friend, right? But as someone who's not necessarily going to come out and attack them, but learn to trust each other. We can see the changes that we want to see, whether it's removing Holocaust denial from Facebook's platform, which was a big success that we were able to be part of last year. That didn't happen overnight. It was that slow pushing of why this matters, sharing our resources and continuing those relationships in a diplomatic way. I think that's really important, behind the scenes, those conversations. And you eventually, we do see the fruits of that labor.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine I know it also takes persistence, right? Policy is one thing. You can get these companies to adopt a policy, but whether they put it into practice, right, that requires some persistence on the part of advocates as well. So, and I know that's your middle name, Holly Persistence Huffnagle. So, Julie.
I'm sorry, can I add something to what Holly just said?
Please.
So,
please.
I'm thinking about one of the realities is, and it really speaks to what Holly was saying, is there is not one answer here. There is not one panacea. There is not one silver bullet. We know that we need to engage elected officials. We know we need to engage political leaders, but we also understand that's not the be all end all. We of course understand that. We need to be doing this at every level. We're engaging our coalition partners. We are engaging the media. We're engaging social media. We're engaging young people. We're engaging diplomats. We're really trying to say across the board, we want to raise awareness about the reality of anti-Semitism, the definition of anti-Semitism, the many ways in which anti-Semitism can manifest. And it is absolutely a marathon, not a sprint. We have to do this at all levels. Each one of us, everyone listening, everyone watching, should be having these conversations too. We understand that. We know that it is really not just about, finding the one right person to tell this to and suddenly everything will be magically different. We understand that. I think the other point that Holly's making that I just want to also just raise with our audience is think about if you work and you are in a workplace with, any number of employees, what sort of training is offered in your company or your firm or your organization? And if you are doing any kind of, mindfulness or diversity training, many companies are doing this now, exactly what Holly just said. Take a look at the curricula. What is being taught and what is not being taught? And how do we address that? So we all have a role to play here. And again, there is not one magic silver bullet, sadly.
So it's a very good point, Melanie. Thank you for making it. And Julie, I wanted to ask you again about the dynamics of Washington, D.C. You were there for the recent vote on Iron Dome, whether to replenish that defense system for Israel. You were there when an environmental group, Sunrise, boycotted a voting rights event because Jewish groups that support the existence of Israel were participating. Truth is, the Hanukkah story isn't a pretty one either, right? It's not really a story about peace on earth and the miracle of everlasting oil. It's a story about this brutal battle in which the temple was desecrated and nearly destroyed, and then this miraculous triumph of a small band of believers over tyranny. So I'm just curious, how can that complexity be useful in educating people about the situation in the Middle East and really just the importance of Israel's mere existence? In other words, can we use the Hanukkah story, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, as an advocacy tool to fight anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Good question. First, I'll say that I love that Hanukkah is this amazing early example showing that Jews are not now and have never been a monolith in terms of opinion, right? Because for as much as it was a battle between the Jews and the Syrian Greeks, it was also this battle between the assimilated Jews and the Zealots, the Maccabees, like the four of us, I guess. And we've been talking a lot about the IRA working definition on this call, and I think it's worth noting that while I think it's universally accepted that anti-Semitism manifests in lots of ways from the far right to the far left and everywhere in between, even the Jewish community in America lacks unity in terms of how to define anti-Semitism. Talking about the old adages, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, it's something that we organizationally support and push, and a lot of the other organizations in part of the Shine the Light campaign are pushing it. But it's not universally accepted even by all Jews. So there are battles within as much as there are battles without. But more to your question, because you talked about Iron Dome, I think we need to be really careful always, not just in this conversation, but in every part of our advocacy and our work, to not equate anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of Israel. That said, the Iron Dome debate in the House was particularly ugly, and I think many Jews across America felt like an unwillingness to support Israel's missile defense signaled a viewing of Jewish lives as expendable, like Jewish lives mattering less. So while it was a vote about Israel, those lines were really blurred for a lot of people. And unfortunately, we're still fighting for Iron Dome funding. The House vote is done, thank goodness it passed. But it's held up in the Senate now, and we're nearing the year's end where there's a government shutdown looming, and this funding hasn't gone through in the Senate. So for everyone who's watching who wants to know what can I do, one thing that you could do is go to ajc.org/fund Iron Dome, and you can send in 30 seconds a quick note to your senator saying, please swiftly pass Iron Dome support. I feel like there are a million answers to the question that you posed. But that's 2, I guess.
I'm thrilled that you mentioned that. I mean, I'm a big believer that there are so many ways of being Jewish. I've written about this. I've talked about this on the podcast. I mean, yes, I'm so glad that you brought that up, that the Maccabees were one kind of, they had one particular kind of way of practicing Judaism, but it really was about the diversity within our tradition. Melanie, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on just how to use, again, that complicated Hanukkah story as a tool for advocacy.
I love what Julie said. And I think the idea of peoplehood and the complexity of peoplehood is so important. And I agree that this is an opportunity for us to utilize the Hanukkah story to help people understand that. One of the challenges we have is that people don't understand the Jewish community. They don't understand the notion of peoplehood. They don't, when we say we are a nation, we are a people, that we were a people without a land, that does not make a lot of sense to most people who don't really understand much about Jews. Therefore, they will wrongly think that anti-Semitism is merely a religious bigotry, an anti-religious bigotry, when we know that anti-Semitism, sometimes it is about the religion, whether it's, the sort of classic Christ killer kinds of tropes about Jews, but that our fundamental sense of peoplehood and identity is often what is being attacked, and that they don't understand that our connection to Israel, for many of us, again, I don't speak for all of us, but for many of us, it is absolutely endemic and intrinsic to our sense of Judaism and Jewishness and peoplehood. And so for many, they think, well, if I'm criticizing Israel, I have no problem with Jews practicing Judaism. I just think Israel shouldn't exist, or I think Israel is the worst place on earth. They don't understand the connection for us because it is part of our peoplehood, and they don't understand how that feels when we hear that, and why we react so strongly, and why that is considered anti-Jewish, even if it is not an anti-religious statement. Again, long way of saying, sure, we can use Hanukkah to help tell the story of our people and peoplehood and complexity. I think it is about, it is a moment in time in our complex and ancient history where we have faced persecution and we have overcome, and that is something we continue to do. We're doing it right now. We're working really hard at it. The battlefronts keep coming. The aggressors keep challenging us, but zealots that we are, we will persist.
Hey, Monica, can I say one more thing really quickly?
Please,
On
please.
that point, because it strikes me that we are coming at this with a sort of a nuanced understanding of what the Hanukkah story is. But the reality is that the Hanukkah narrative is not really about the fight at all, right? Like, it's not about the massacres. It's not about the bloodshed, the sacking of the temple. It's about exactly what happened after, right? It's about the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 nights. And the fight is sort of this weird prologue that's often overlooked, if not ignored. And maybe there's a lesson there, right? That, like, it's not about the perils that we're enduring, because those will continue to exist in almost every generation, but it's about what we do after, right? Like, it's about what is that next step, and how do we, God, I'm belaboring this analogy, but like, how do we continue to shine our lights? Like, how do we hold on to that resilience that has kept us and our traditions alive for so many centuries?
Well, Hanukkah is often referred to as a minor holiday, right? I mean, I think people who are not Jewish think of it as a major holiday because it's coupled with Christmas all the time. This year it's coupled with Thanksgiving, but I'm wondering, should it be a minor holiday? I mean, is this a moment in our history? Is this an opportunity even to kind of to elevate Hanukkah as a more meaningful observance for Jews? Should we perhaps make this a holiday when Jews can rededicate themselves to the fight for freedom, or to the memory of those who managed to escape other persecutions? Melanie, you mentioned those other persecutions, right? The series of persecutions over time. Should we be lighting a candle, for the pogroms, and lighting a candle for, for the Holocaust?
I think that I think we can always think about that. I think we have to think about our history in totality, and I think we have to think about how our history connects to global history and world history. Jewish history is world history. So I think we have to be mindful of that. I also, as we think about Hanukkah, I think where we started in this conversation was this kind of dichotomy between the heaviness and the joy. And I think we can be remembering the heaviness and also celebrating the enormous miracles of Jewish life, of Jewish persistence, of the state of Israel, of Jewish continuity. There is so much to celebrate. So I think they are part of a continuum of again, Jewish peoplehood, Jewish existence, Jewish history. And we have to not forget the painful and the bad, but also never lose sight of the absolute joy and reasons to celebrate.
So speaking of joy, and I'm sorry to go dark in this conversation, but I think joy came out of that conversation, as it often does, right, in the Jewish tradition. But Holly, I want to turn to you, because my children love the shamash candle, the helper candle. Just the mere fact that there are 8 days of Hanukkah, yet 9 candles. And unless you know the story, if you're looking at that candle holder, you're totally baffled, right? Because why are there 9 if there are only 8 days of Hanukkah? My children love knowing the secret behind that. But they also love that without that one candle, the others don't get lit. I mean, that candle exists to help the other candles. So how can the Jewish community mobilize our helpers our allies in this fight?
I really appreciate this, Manya, because I think it really is about the Jewish community being the helper candle, right, to other communities in the United States to help them understand anti-Semitism. We know from our survey that 64% of Americans personally know someone who is Jewish, which means that, 1 in 3 Americans don't know anyone who is Jewish, but 64% of Americans do know someone who's Jewish, which I think does speak for itself, considering that Jews are such a small percentage, less than 2% of the American population. But we learned that those who do know someone who's Jewish, they were more likely to know what anti-Semitism is. They were more likely to see that it's a problem, to know that it was a problem in the United States, and they were more likely to know that it has increased in the past 5 years. So there was this connection here. And so I think the Jewish communities and its allies, again, can really be part of not just coalitions, but even educational campaigns, again, going back to that awareness, but letting those other candles, those other community candles, if you will, know that it's not just a religious bias. Again, explaining diversity of Jewish life in America, explaining how anti-Semitism differs from other forms of racism, the conspiratorial nature of it, and how it can even be more insidious, and why we need to ensure it's taken as seriously as other forms of hate and bigotry. That was another discovery we had in our survey. We found that sizable minorities, 46% of American Jews, but sizable minorities of American Jews and U.S. adults believe that anti-Semitism is taken less seriously than other forms of hate and bigotry. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And again, I think as Melanie said, we need to raise awareness about that long duration of Jewish history, that we're in a moment right now. And just because some people, especially maybe on the left or the far left, might see Jews as white and privileged and therefore not victims of discrimination, given their distance from being oppressed, that doesn't mean that position is going to hold and that anti-Semitism can go unchecked. Again, and so that those are part of those awareness raising campaigns that Jews and our allies need to be part of. And finally, I think the biggest thing that we can do is really to explain this connection of why this all matters for non-Jews. Why should CEOs of companies speak out against anti-Semitism if they're not Jewish? Why should elected officials, not just because their Jewish constituents are asking them to, because it matters for something so much more than just the safety and well-being of the Jewish community. And when we can really explain how and why anti-Semitism is not just an attack on Jews, but it is that assault on our the core values of our democracy and pluralism, that when we explain that the 2,000, 3,000, this millennia of persecution against Jews, like the rooting of conspiratorial thinking, of scapegoating, of how to blame others for things when they go wrong, things that actually happen to other minority communities now. That's all rooted in anti-Semitism. And when we understand anti-Semitism better, we can actually help others, more effectively. And so I think when we broaden it a little bit in order to build those coalitions, like that's really where that helper candle will be most effective.
Okay. This is a live podcast, so I would like to turn now to questions from our live audience. Claire, are you out there? Who are we hearing from?
Thank you, Manya. So our first question comes from Jay Sherman in Kansas City. It's for you, Melanie. You spoke a little bit about local governments and municipalities. How can they be more proactive rather than reactive in the fight against anti-Semitism? And how can we bring them and other local coalitions into our fight?
Thank you. It's a great question. And we have a wonderful region in Kansas City that is doing great work. One of the things we recommend to mayors in particular and city governments and municipal governments is to make sure they have a point person that is charged with staying in close contact with the Jewish community, with the organizational community, with synagogues, with any schools or day schools, whatever it may be, so that there is a clear line of communication and that issues can be addressed as they arise, that there's an understanding of security needs, that there are strong lines of open communication. And then I think, again, we ask our elected officials and mayors, as we think about our cities and towns, to incorporate this into their messaging. There is often a desire to universalize some of these issues. And of course, we too are against all forms of bigotry. We understand that impulse to universalize, but one of our messages to many of the leaders with whom we interact is it's important, of course, to address all of these. But as Holly was saying, there is something particular about anti-Semitism, the insidiousness of it, the long duration of it, its ability to shapeshift, all of those things that have for so many years in so many ways led it to become the harbinger of more ills to follow. And so they need to understand it and call it out specifically for what it is. And we have to make sure they have a little bit of spine too, and that they're willing to stand up and stand with us. So a lot of it is really, it's about that ongoing engagement. There are some, again, very specific things we recommend to governments. Share and adopt the IRA definition so that the people in your government understand that you see as the leader of this, whatever the government body is, the complexity of anti-Semitism, appoint someone to be the point person, meet regularly with the Jewish community and with Jewish leaders so that there is that open line of communication and understanding what the needs are of the community, joining us in our celebrations. Again, like there are a lot of ways that our leaders can demonstrate their connection to and support for the Jewish community.
Thank you. Our next question is for you, Holly, and it's from Norman Buckner in Seattle. And he's asking, can you explain the importance of confirming an anti-Semitism envoy? Why does it matter to have someone in that role, and what difference could they make?
Thank you, Norman, and thank you, Claire. I'm guessing that this position is referring to our special envoy position in the U.S. Department of State, which is abroad and it's international looking. There has been some conversations of whether it be positive or negative idea to have someone focus domestically, but I'll speak specifically to the importance of having someone in the position in the U.S. Department of State to focus abroad. And right now there has been a person that's been nominated by President Biden, Deborah Lipstadt, who's out of Emory University. And she's one of the best scholars on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And I think when we look at the number of Jewish communal organizations, Jewish communities who have allotted her appointment and have agreed on her appointment, that says something, having everyone across the spectrum agree. So she's waiting for confirmation right now. But the importance of that appointment is, and this was an office, just full disclosure for everyone's call, I used to work in this office before coming to AJC, but the United States prides itself in our leadership, in our ability to lead with our morals and our values, and to have an office in the State Department that's to get dedicated solely to combating anti-Semitism. And this was a bipartisan legislation, the Global Anti-Semitism Review Act of 2004, signed into law by President George W. Bush. It's not a partisan position. It's bipartisan. Each president or secretary of state can appoint someone. There's been this will be the fifth envoy in the role. Deborah Lipstadt, if she's confirmed, will be the fifth envoy, and it would be an ambassador level. And this is hence the process of confirmation, because we've actually raised it to the level of ambassador, and that's how important we are seeing this issue in the United States. But it's really about our leadership, and without that person in that position, I do think we can. The fight against anti-Semitism, the fight against global anti-Semitism can suffer. It's all about our allies and who we work with. But I do think for us to be a moral leading voice, we need to have someone in that office and really take the lessons that we've learned even within the United States, around the world. It was something that Jewish communities, when we would meet with Jewish communities all over the world, they would so appreciate. And sometimes we'd have to do it in secret. We weren't publicly telling the governments of places we were going to that we were meeting with the Jewish community. But when they saw that an American official cared about them, saw them, helped provide funding for their security needs, helped them with issues they were facing, it was just, they were so appreciative. And so I think it's really important that we continue to urge the Senate to have this hearing for Deborah Lipstadt, that she is formally appointed and can start in this role.
I will say Deborah Lipstadt was one of my favorite guests on the podcast. The way that she talks about the various sources of anti-Semitism and just presents it, it's just quite brilliant, actually. And yeah, I encourage listeners to look back, and if you haven't heard it already, you should listen to that podcast.
Thank you. And our last question before I turn it back to you, Manya, is actually for all three of you, but Julie, I'll start with you. What advice do you have for the next generation of advocates who are working to fight anti-Semitism wherever they see it? And Melanie, Holly, I'd love for you to jump in as well.
I think that, and this goes back to the first question that Manya had posed about, how do we conceptualize Hanukkah? I think that we often, especially in the advocacy world, are on the defensive, right? We see the challenges ahead of us and allow those challenges to steer our course. And if we instead can be offensive is the wrong word, but forward leaning and truly proud about Judaism, about our heritage, about our culture, about our ties to Israel, all of those things, then a lot of these fights that we're facing will be mitigated, right? If we can show that strength from within, individually and as a community, then it alleviates the burden for the collective.
And I would add to that, one of the other ways to build that sense of Jewish pride is to just be informed yourself. We can't expect others to understand the nuances and complexity of our challenges if we don't also understand them ourselves. So it is incumbent upon all of us to really dive in, learn our own history. And again, we believe at AJC that educating ourselves in whatever way, it's not necessarily formal Jewish education, whatever it is, there are a lot of good books to read. There's a lot of, and there are things that are available for all age ranges. But know your history.
Good podcasts to listen to.
Lots of good podcasts, like People of the Pod to listen to. And that will help us with our sense of Jewish pride, and our Jewish pride is what has allowed us to endure.
I'll say two things to add to both of the powerful suggestions that Melanie and Julie raised. But, when I think about the future generation of advocates, I think automatically even of non-Jewish advocates, people like me who understand how important this issue is for everyone. And so, yes, for Jewish advocates, younger generation of Jewish advocates, I do think it means sharing what they're experiencing with vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, whether it be online, in their high school, on their college campuses, with people who are in the fight now, like, practitioners, whether it be at AJC or, government leaders, so we can actually have a glimpse of what the future of anti-Semitism might look like. They're experiencing this new forms even as we speak. And so they can continue to share that information. But again, building those alliances with non-Jews and explaining why this is an issue. And I think using language, like we can work to improve the narrative, like how we share the story depending on the audience. So there'll be different ways of explaining it to maybe conservative Christian, like younger generation of conservative Christians versus young progressives, and using even the language of progressives, how, we talk about Israel, this is about a liberation. Israel is a story of liberation of a marginalized people. And, taking that taking Israel away or saying Israel shouldn't exist, you're putting a minority back into a state of powerlessness. Like, this is the language that, the left and the progressive left is using. But when we can explain that with this younger generation and build those alliances, I think we'll actually be much more successful in understanding anti-Semitism in all forms and the fight against it in the future for this next generation.
Thank you so much, ladies. Really appreciate all those wonderful thoughts. Melanie, Julie, happy Hanukkah on this 5th day. And Holly, I hope you have a fulfilling Advent and a Merry Christmas. And thank you for joining us, audience. Thank you for sticking with us through this conversation. If you are not already a subscriber to People of the Pod, I urge you to become one. You can hear this conversation again and a special musical guest when this podcast airs later today. So Chag Sameach to everyone. And Claire, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Manya. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in today. It's up to each one of us to turn darkness into light. If you'd like to join American Jewish Committee in the fight against anti-Semitism, please consider making a year-end donation to AJC. If you make your gift before December 31st, it will be doubled. You can visit ajc.org/donate, or you can text AJC donate to 52886. That's AJC space donate to 52886. We've also shared this information in the chat. And lastly, for more information on Shine a Light, including a list of helpful resources and upcoming events, please visit shinealighton.com. Thank you again, and goodbye.